welcome to this week's edition of the book club reading of Star Wars Aftermath Empire's End. If you're not familiar with this series, you can go ahead and click here, and it'll take you back to the beginning of the first book we did, but basically we're going through the Aftermath trilogy, a couple of chapters at a time, breaking down the themes. We're already on the third book, and if you want to join us starting with the third book, go ahead and click on this playlist here. But today we're going to discuss Chapter 9 and the interlude that follows. So the big thing with Chapter 9 is the first time we're seeing in this book Sloane. Ray Sloane has, unless she was in a small segment that I hadn't seen, or am not remembering, this is the first time we've seen her in Empire's End, and it's Chapter 9. She's still traveling around with Brenton. This particular chapter is structured a little bit differently than any other chapter I've read through the trilogy thus far, where they show you, like, the middle of the chapter, and then they go back to the beginning of the chapter, and then they go to the end of the chapter. So basically it opens with Sloane and Brenton being taken to Nima the Hutt here on Jakku, and then it goes back to how they found Nima, or Naima, however you would say it, N-I-I-M-A, and then it goes to their conclusion of talking to Nima. I guess I want to say Nima because of Nima Outpost. I have no idea if they're actually connected or even spelled the same, but that's just Nima and Jakku is in my head, so that could be wrong. But it is interesting seeing her, and it gets into kind of the weird, odd couple relationship she has with Brenton, right? Like, they're only together and working together at all because they both want to kill Rax. They both see Rax as somebody who's taken a lot from them, but really Brenton has every reason to hate Sloane. So they kind of have this odd thing going, and they're both people who are built very much on vengeance at this point, which is interesting because we've seen so much of Nora wanting vengeance on Sloane, wanting revenge on Sloane, and here we see Sloane also wanting vengeance and revenge on Rax, along with Brenton, Nora's husband. And what's kind of interesting is really at the end of the day, Nora would probably like revenge on Rax too. She would probably also like revenge on Sloane. Like, she does have personal reasons for not liking Sloane, but they have this shared enemy in Rax, and Nora has no idea who Rax is. So these three characters are kind of intertwined with Rax in a very odd way, which is interesting to see how this is playing out. When we get to Nima, it's a very Mad Maxian sort of society. It's these people who are all, like, they've got weird piercings, and they're covered in dust, and they're doing all this to, like, serve this hut, and they, like, do a giant, like, thing at a concert where you, like, the hut, like, walks around on their hands. So this hut has a very big, like, god complex, as it were. And then we jump back, and we figure out the story, and basically Sloane gets to Jakku and starts asking around about Gallius Rax. Gallius Rax doesn't exist. There's the character of Galli. People remember this orphan who used to live at this orphanage, who just kind of one day started acting really weird. Of course, this is largely when, after Galli comes back from interacting with Palpatine, Galli starts making this stronghold out of the plaintive hand, which is a seemingly a rock formation, steals other children from these orphanages and, like, enlists them to help protect the area, trains beasts. Like, he's a very sharp kid that's doing these really, really terrible things, and then eventually the nearby orphanage burns down, which is also implied to be Galli. So Galli kind of has this big legend, basically, going on here on Jakku, and it's kind of interesting to see this feral origin to such a calm and, like, you know, with Opera, like, this sophisticated villain who had this really intense start, and it adds a lot of layers to Rax as a character. Once Sloane and Brenton know about this plaintive hand area, they start to head there, and now there's an Imperial base. And this is where Rax has taken the Empire. So at the end of Life Debt, he says we're all going to go to Jakku because Jakku is a test. This is that testing ground. They have been there for a while. And basically all of the Imperials are starting to go feral. So they're not, you know, Sloane comments on how they're not the disciplined, orderly Imperials that she knows. Like, they all have dirty armor, they're gruff, they're wild. I mean, feral really is the right word for what's going on here. And they find a trooper who is not a true believer, and when he expresses some discontent, his fellow Imperials basically beat the crap out of him. Sloane makes friends with this character, gets information out of him, and when it looks like she's going to let him go, she ends up killing him. Though it seems less of an act of violence or cruelty, but more, in her mind, kind of like an act of mercy, because he's beyond help in this place that they're at. And what's interesting is no one who's here at this base really seems to know what's going on. There's rumors of a weapon, but they don't really know. Another thing that's interesting here is Sloane talks about how she's talking about Brenton. She's talking about this relationship she has with Brenton, and Brenton, even though he wants to kill Sloane, even though he wants to kill Rax quite a bit, he also will probably turn on Sloane at some point when they don't have a shared goal. And she describes how he hates her, and it doesn't surprise her because she says that his is a rebellion built on anger and hatred, which is kind of funny when you compare it to Rogue One, where they keep saying that rebellions are built on hope. So it goes to this difference of perception that we've seen in other Star Wars media, that Sloane is seeing the rebellion as a gang of terrorists that hate order and whatnot, as opposed to how the rebellion, of course, sees themselves. And it's just another layer to how Sloane is one of the bad guys, but doesn't really realize that she's one of the bad guys. Now, when they actually meet with Nemo, this is a big point for Sloane, because Sloane is trying to play this strategically. She knows that Hutts like to be worshipped, so she tries to play it from a place of praise towards the Hutt. She's trying to make the Hutt feel good about herself in a way that's very subservient, and Sloane thinks about how she's not particularly good at this. She doesn't really know how to do it. And Sloane realizes that over the course of this conversation, she's kind of put herself in a position of weakness, and in fact does kind of have a position of weakness. And Sloane thinks about, she's already kind of convinced that she's going to die on Naboo. She's never going to be a Grand Admiral. Like, she's been losing hope. And in this moment, she realizes she's bungled this deal with this Hutt, and that she and Brenton are about to be, like, conscripted into the Hutt worship force. And she's not really sure what to do. And then Sloane kind of finds that inner strength that is so admirable about the character. And she stands up and she's like, you know what? No. I'm going to tell this Hutt what's up. I'm going to say Rax is going to go down. I'm going to speak from a place of confidence. And I liked it because it was Sloane going into a place of weakness, but Sloane thought she was going into that place of weakness because it was tactical. And really that was Sloane lying to herself. I think that was Sloane's own kind of going into weakness that was starting to hit the character just from all of this time. A significant portion of time has passed since they've been on Jakku. It's interesting to kind of see that. I think that's something really well done, where a character is kind of playing something a certain way and they think it's a lie, then it's not actually a lie, and it reveals something about that character. And then that revelation causes Sloane to find a greater strength within herself. So even though this is like a really wacky Mad Max kind of chapter, it's a really important chapter for Sloane, because we're seeing her start out at her lowest point, basically. She's injured, she's in pain, she's still hurt from Nora from the end of life debt because they've been on Jakku. She doesn't have the ability to heal herself properly, and she has no power, no authority, and she's groveling before a Hutt. And then for her to kind of find her inner strength and her Sloaneness again was a big part of the chapter. Then we go on to the second interlude of the book. This is Theed. This interlude connects to an interlude we saw in Aftermath Prime, the first Aftermath book that was also on Theed. It was the 12th interlude from that book, where there was a group of orphans, and we saw that the orphans wanted to get adopted, and there was one little boy who didn't want to join, and he ends up sneaking off to join the ankle biters back on Coruscant. So that was a interlude that tied into a different interlude in Prime to talk about the Ankle Biter Brigade on Coruscant, which will still kind of become a little bit more important, if I'm not mistaken, in this book. But then this just kind of goes back to Naboo, as Naboo being this kind of refugee, orphanage-like planet. Here we have a little boy who we will eventually find out was mutilated by an explosion on his homeworld. The Empire had a fuel depot there. The Empire was done with that planet, presumably was running from the rebellion, and blew the fuel plant up so that the rebels couldn't have it. Again, presumably, the kid was very young when it happened, so he's just kind of piecing together what might be going on. And, his face is half burned, one of his arms barely works, and he's having a hard time getting adopted because he, in his mind, it's because he's not approachable, he's ugly, he's damaged, he's whatever, and so he's really struggling because he hasn't been able to find a home. And then he meets the town clown, and this clown is Jar Jar Binks. So this was a very interesting interlude when the book came out. People were really surprised because it's one of the first times Jar Jar had been, like, if not still might be one of the only times Jar Jar has been brought back into canon outside of Star Wars The Clone Wars. First we'd really ever seen of him post Return of the Jedi to, like, know that he had actually survived that far. And so the nature of this interlude and whether or not you like this interlude is going to depend a lot on your opinion of Jar Jar Binks. To me, the most interesting thing about this interlude is that it deals with Jar Jar's fateful moment in Attack the Clones, where he's the one that gives emergency powers to the Supreme Chancellor. And he talks about how, you know, the adults don't like him because they think he helped the Empire. Of course, he means he helped form the Empire. And this is a really interesting callback, and it's something I hadn't really considered until this interlude, is that Jar Jar, he would have suffered some social capital, if as you will, for what he did. Of course, that's in Attack of the Clones, and we don't see it anywhere in the prequel trilogy or in Star Wars The Clone Wars, any kind of fallout he would have had from that point, because there was no reason for there to be fallout from that point. It's not until the end of Revenge of the Sith that we learned that the Chancellor became an Emperor. So this is something where we actually get to see the repercussions of something from Attack of the Clones all the way at the end of Return of the Jedi. And it's kind of interesting to take such a critical point and look at it way down the way. And I like it from that perspective. And I also like it as an example of how something, the perception of an action can change over time. How it was something that was conceivably a good thing in Attack of the Clones, but then we would come to know better. I also really like it because there's this kind of discrepancy, I guess, between what people would and wouldn't know in the different Star Wars trilogies. The idea that knowledge of the Jedi basically went away in like 20 years between the two trilogies, and basically what you have is anybody who's alive and, you know, old enough to remember the prequel era, obviously they would not have history rewritten for them, although it might have been taught to them via the news, not as history, in a way that wasn't entirely truthful, just from the nature of the size of the galaxy and what side of the war they were on. But then you would have young people who would have absolutely no concept. That's the strongest part of the interlude to me. It is a sweet moment between Jar Jar and this kid. I think it does show a lot of the strengths of Jar Jar's character, his kind of silliness, how he's got this ability to kind of bring a smile to everyone's face, and this idea that he's almost kind of doing this community service to make these orphans smile, because he feels so guilty about what he's done. And it's kind of odd to see Jar Jar in a story where he is feeling bad about something he has done. So I personally like this interlude a lot. I feel like at times it's a little wonky because it's a little bit on the nose, like just from a large scale, like, pop culture understanding, Jar Jar is not a popular character. I think he's become a popular character within the Star Wars fandom, as fans have kind of come around to embrace Ahmed Best again, but still the general pop culture doesn't really consider him a popular character. So it's an interlude about Jar Jar and his popularity and respect within the Star Wars universe, but also kind of a commentary a bit on Jar Jar within the larger actual real world universe. And maybe I'm reading into it, but that's the kind of thing where I'm like, this feels a little bit too meta in a book that doesn't have a lot of meta anywhere else, but it's not a big enough problem to detract, and I think it adds so much to Jar Jar's character to actually give him some depth that I actually really do like the interlude, if that makes sense. And again, I don't even necessarily mind the meta-ness, it's that it's like, I feel like this is the one interlude that's meta, and that's why it kind of sticks out, if that makes sense. It's just more of a consistency thing than it is an actual problem with it thing. But that's what I have for this week. I did enjoy these readings. Like I said, it was only 2 things because one chapter was really long. For next week, we're going to read chapters 10 and 11, and 10 and 11 will bring us to the end of part 1 and take us to the start of part 2. So basically, for next week, please finish this part of the book. Also, please leave me a comment on what you think of the story so far. I really like interacting with you guys. If you're not already, please follow us on all the socials, and I definitely encourage you to join the Discord. And with that, I will talk to you guys next week.